I am Dr. Mildred Boveda. I am a special education researcher and a university professor, and I am here to tell you a story about my time at Harvard. And not all of my time at Harvard, I actually had a really great time. If you want to know more about my experiences, I was very fortunate enough to be selected as something, it's an honor called the Intellectual Contribution Award, which is really kind by my professors and classmates. And I have a link to an interview related to my experience there that was pretty great. And if you want to hear more about or learn more about, read more about my entire educational journey and how I became a professor, and which is what I'm talking about in many of these videos that I am making recently, there's an article from Feminist Formation that I put in the description as well. But I'm going to talk about one particular class that I had, which I keep going back to that class over and over again. And I'm going to talk about my experience there because there was a book that I was recommended that's in this list that I co-constructed with a couple of my colleagues. It's called Gaining Clarity 2025, and it lists a bunch of things like books and articles and podcasts and webinars and policy memos that have recently come out about educational institutions, specifically higher ed, that list. But one of the books is called Democracy Unchained, and it was suggested that my friend suggested it. One of my friends suggested that I read it about 2 years ago, and I did. And there were so many things that took me back to 2010 in this class. And one of the things is the role that Brown versus Board had. And the other thing also is this notion that there are think tanks that are very intentional and strategic. This is an argument that the historian who wrote the book, which by the way, the book is controversial, but to me, it resonated deeply on my own experiences. Anyways, she argues that there's a lot of intentionality about making sure people are trained to influence the academy, research, fellowships, and like this intentional push of political ideologies through a long game. And that resonated with me because in this particular class that I'm talking about, and I'm not going to name the professor, I'm not going to gender the professor either, non-gendered, non-named. If you know, you know, right? If you were there with me in 2010, you know. But this person one time said in class that they dreamed of becoming the president of Harvard. And I remember being like, whoa, that is a fascinating dream, because I remember I used to want to be a scientist when I grew up, and my friends wanted to be lawyers and basketball players. But to dream to be a university professor, I found that to be very peculiar, and I kind of pinned that in my mind. A lot of peculiar things happen in this course. So let's start with the beginning. When I got into Harvard, I had been teaching for 5 years in Miami. I was a special education teacher. And I was very blessed to be an award-winning teacher. I was awarded Rookie Teacher of the Year for the district for special education by this organization called CEC, Council for Exceptional Children. And I also won a state award, which was really affirming for me. I taught in the same community, like it was about like 5-minute drive away from the elementary school that I went to. I taught in nearby in the same community that I grew up in. And so it was nice to have moments like that where people acknowledge the work that we did as teachers. But I also had very frustrated moments because it felt like more and more politics and politicians were dictating curriculum and what schooling experience was like than when I was in school, when I was a little girl. So I became very interested in education policy. And in fact, I was interviewed, if you want to read how frustrated I was as a classroom teacher. My last year, I think I had already been accepted to Harvard as a teacher. I'm going to link an interview. It's not an interview just with me. It was a story in the journal in these times, or in the newspaper. I think it's a newspaper in these times. I'm going to link it there. So I have several things for you if you want to look into the background of my educational journey and my professional decisions. There's a couple of things there for you to check out. Okay. So I'm super excited to go to Harvard. I bring from Miami, Florida. I bring my kids, my mom, who had never gone to school. My mom had 1 year of schooling. She learned how to read and write, which my grandparents didn't know how to read or write. She learned how to read and write, but she never went to school herself, right? So I brought her with me. She came to Harvard with me. She was with us for several months, helping me out with the kids. My husband was a longshoreman, which is very important, union man. And so we started looking for potential jobs for him in Massachusetts, but he was in Florida holding us down. And I lived in Harvard Square with my kids. Great, right? And so we were super excited. And Harvard had this tradition, I don't know if it still does, where you can shop a class before you select it. And so what I did was I went to multiple classes, checked them out, but there was one class on ed policy. I think that was the title of it. It was on US education policy. And as a classroom teacher, I wanted to be a policy maker, policy influencer. I wanted to understand how policies were made because at that time I didn't understand why certain policies were in effect when all they did was stigmatize the schools that I taught in instead of being helpful. At least that's how I felt then. So I took this class, I shopped it. And then when I shopped it, I asked the professor, had they ever taught? And the person bristled a bit, you know. And this is fascinating because there's so many lessons that I learned from this particular person in this particular class. But I come from an oral tradition. And yes, Dominicans of my mom's generation, she was older. She was older when she had me. They had a saying, I'm going to say it in Spanish and then I'm going to translate it in English. Children talk, well, I'm going to say it in English first. Children talk when chickens urinate, which if you know anything about chickens, you're not going to see the traditional flow of other animals in chickens, right? Basically, los niños hablan cuando la gallina mean, which is not the nicest word, which is basically saying kids don't talk. But my mom was a little different. She indulged all of my questions. And so I would ask her a billion questions, I mean, hard questions. And I don't really think there was one question she never answered, which was, Mommy, am I pretty? And she just looked at me like it was the silliest question in the world. But any other question I ever asked Mommy, she gave me the answer. I mean, she was just so forthright with me and she took me very seriously as a human. I was very blessed. And then also I'm a member of the Church of Christ, which is, if you know anything about it, they're the ones, if you know Pepperdine University, it has like that background. It was like Church of Christ background, Harding University. Anyways, we were I don't know if we're still known for this, but growing up, we were understood to like be Bible nerds, right? Like I learned what a scholar was uh through like Bible classes and the expectation for you to know your scriptures, to ask questions, to be engaged, um, that any member can fact check, right? Or go back to the book and question, not out of like questioning authority, but just ask questions, that it was encouraged, right? That it was encouraged not to just blindly take what the preacher or a teacher was saying. And in fact, my mom was very highly respected in the church. Every congregation I ever went to the very end of her life, she was respected because she was so knowledgeable about her Bible, right? So I had been reinforced as a Bible school student and a Bible school teacher to ask questions at schools. I had mostly Black women teachers and principals, elementary and middle school. And then when I went to high school, it was mostly white men in the IB program. I had several white male teachers, but they were also super culturally competent and they understood me. You know what I mean? I asked a billion questions and always had something to say. So when I asked him that question, I asked the person that question. When I asked them that question in the class, they they seemed challenged, and that wasn't my intention. I was just asking a question because I had always asked questions, and I was like, let me take the class. I think that this class is going to be different than what I know. I think it's kind of important if I want to understand policy, to understand different perspectives. I took the class. And in that class, yes, I told you about that interesting comment about wanting to become the president. And this person's actually an administrator there now too. So maybe one day they'll become the president. We'll talk about presidents of universities in the future. But this one is just about this class. So yeah, my classmates, I sat in the front like a good nerd, like a good little student. And today I've come to understand that a lot of times when women, especially women of color, are very engage with professors, sometimes they may be read as being adversarial and confrontational, but I always understand that that's a form of being engaged. So I was super engaged. I was reading all of the discussion board posts. I was asking questions and I was going to office hours. But I noticed that some of my peers started kind of disengaging, even though they took the class. I actually talked to a friend, a classmate from the class, a Black man, and I remember he literally would sit at the margins of the class, right? It was like a group of us here, a group here towards the wall, another group here towards the wall. And like it was like people started moving that way. But I stood the course and I remember one time I didn't understand academia. And so one time there was some like donors who must have come into the class. There were two older white people, gray hair, and they were so annoyed with me, right? They were so annoyed with me. Well, I got like even like a face made at me by the woman. And the professor seemed tickled by their reaction to me. But I was like, whoa, as a teacher, as somebody who had taught since I was very young, like Bible classes, and also as a public school teacher, I was like, you respect any guest who comes into the classroom, respects my students, respects my class. So I thought that was odd. So stuff like that would happen. There was a book that we read, and I remember being kind of offended because it argued that Brown versus Board wasn't as effective at desegregating, which is a fair kind of desegregating schools, by the way, which is there is an argument to be had about the effectiveness of that strategy, but it was too dismissive. And I said that. I remember going after class and going up and being like, I think this is a little bit too dismissive of the Black liberation, Black Americans, African Americans mobilizing and strategizing for civil rights. And I mentioned that all good. Like there was one student, she was Asian American, who was so bothered by the way we would interact with each other. But again, I wasn't that bothered by it, that she went and she spoke to this person. Um, and the professor brought it up to me during an office hour that I had with them. And I could just tell a lot of stories. The class ends, and one of my classmates asked me, "Oh, you're gonna get him. You're gonna get him. You're gonna get him you're gonna get this professor in the evaluation." And I was like, "Why would I do that? This person comes prepared, focused. I don't agree with them. Like I actually am aggravated by some of the readings that we had. My husband was a longshoreman. I mentioned very pro-union. I am very pro-union and the pro-labor, and some of the readings were clearly anti-union and anti-labor. So, but why would I passively aggressively, you know, attack this person or critique this person when, I said it to their face. No, I got an A- in the class. I'm not really a grades person. I don't know what would have been the difference between an A and an A-. I was satisfied with that, and whatever. Um, but that was interesting that student, that was a classmate in that class, assumed that I was going to get him. And I'm not that person. So interestingly, they have winter sessions. And so the winter sessions, you take classes, super nerds take extra classes in the winter. And I took a class. I took a class with Tom Hare, who has passed away. It was a great class. It's when I first learned the concept of ableism. So even though I had been a special education teacher, I was introduced to the term later on after years of teaching. It was a great class. I was walking around, in front of Gutman Library, and I bumped into this professor, and the professor comes up to me and asks, "Did you tell people not to take my winter class?" And I was like, "What are you talking about? Of course not. I didn't even know you were teaching a winter class." It was a class on market-based reform, and I guess the registration was low. And it reminds me of the recent song and lyric by Kendrick Lamar, like they wanna rig the game, but you can't fake the influence. The assumption that I was trying to rig something against them, against this class, is ridiculous. People didn't want to take the class. The class was not a class that people wanted to take. And I wasn't trying to, rig anything. Later on, I figured out what was going on. That was projection, because I would never go above and beyond to tell someone not to do something, to stop someone from taking a class. or at least not then, right? Now that I understand things a little bit differently, maybe I would be a little bit more proactive in warning people about taking the class, but not then, definitely not then. So, okay, that happened. Still, no big deal. I had applied for a doctoral program. I did not get in, which was disappointing. But I had a family and my husband had a job in South Florida, and I got into Florida International University. Again, in a future video, I'm going to talk about FIU because that's a very important place right now. There's a lot of interesting things happening at FIU, my alma mater, where I got my doctorate from. But it was strange, right? And I remember Tom Hare especially was upset because he wrote a letter of recommendation for me. It was like he didn't understand. And I'm like, it's not a fit. It's all good. You know, like I said, I won a lot of accolades during my time there. I got a lot from my experience. I graduated. And when I graduate, I had been doing an internship with the office, a paid internship, very nice, with the Office of English Language Learners with Boston Public Schools at that time, met some cool people. John Diamond was a professor at Harvard at that time, and hooked me up with access to um, the Gutman Library. And so there was a professional development event that was happening with Boston Public Schools English language learners. And I was able to host or use, we were able to use the Gutman Library, the facilities to host these Boston public school teachers. And, you know, which was a great thing. I saved money for the public school district. And it was cool because teachers wanted to be on Harvard's campus. All good. So I had graduated in May, I believe, or in June, May, June, gone home, started my doc program, but returned in August for this particular event. And guess what happened? During the event, I bumped into this professor again. Bump into the professor, and the professor looks at me. And like I told you, I come from the church. This video is being posted after church. But out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks is something my mom would always say that to me in Spanish. It's a verse, meaning like bursts from the mouth come from the heart. When this person bumped into me, they said, I can't get rid of you. 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 So we chatted. No big deal. So good to see you. I'm doing all right. Wishing you well. But it was as if the scales had come out of my eyes. And finally, I saw what many of my peers had seen, that I guess because I was a teacher and I held education as something so sacred, and the teacher-student dynamic was something that I treasured so much, that as a special ed teacher, sometimes you have students who give you a really hard time, but you still love them no matter how difficult they may be. And, you know, I just really respected my teachers. I had a lot of respect for this person, even if I didn't agree with them. But I learned a very important lesson. Not every university professor sees themselves as a teacher. And in fact, that sacredness that I thought, you know, that I was engaging in the teacher-student dynamic was not necessarily reciprocated. And also, I learned that people are threatened by people who question. And it was almost like an unintended prophecy. No, you can't get rid of me. No, you can't get rid of me. You're not going to get rid of me. Like, you're not. I'm still here. I'm still talking. I'm still engaged in education, literature, research, policy, practice. I'm a teacher educator. And, you know, I have no hard feelings, but I've been keeping track of a lot of the things that are coming from the think tanks, because we would have a lot of readings from think tanks, and it was definitely a different perspective of ed policy than I've received in other spaces. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot. I learned the academy, you know, people have research agendas. It's called agendas for a reason. A lot of people know how to perform objectivity, very objective, but it's a performance because people have intentionality. And all that to say is check out the book, Democracy in Chains. I recommend it. It resonated true to me. The historian is not an education researcher. The historian begins talking about how they even how she even got to the topic. And yeah, check out the reading list that the Getting Clarity 2025 reading list, because of this class, I think it was very easy for me when all of this started kind of like rapidly happening. When I mean by rapidly happening, all of this is these like concerted attacks and takeovers of educational institutions, because I was able to kind of follow some of the people that I was introduced to in this class at Harvard. All right, I'm going to wrap it up there. Blessings to you. It's a Sunday today when I'm making this video. Whatever day you watch this video, sending you good wishes. Get educated, get informed, get clarity, win the peace. Education is under attack, is under threat right now. Public education, which has given many of us opportunities that many of our elders and ancestors didn't have. We need to preserve it. We need to preserve it. We need to improve it. And that's it. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.